Welcome back, everyone, to our Journey Through History series. Today, we will begin with Chapter 12, the Jena Campaign. Jena ranks with the Blitzkrieg campaigns of the 20th century as an example of speed and decisiveness. Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz left Prussia's King Frederick William III, who had planned to join the war in the event of the expected Allied triumph, in an impossible position. Napoleon imposed harsh terms on Prussia, depriving it of territory and drawing it into his network of alliances designed to increase the isolation of Britain. Not all Prussians would accept this, and a patriotic party coalesced around the strong-minded Queen Louise, who Napoleon described as the only real man in Prussia. News that Napoleon planned to violate his recent agreement, as well as early stirrings of pan-German nationalism, edged the Prussians towards war. The Prussian army enjoyed a high reputation, but as Clausewitz, later a well-known military theorist, but a regimental adjutant at the time, observed, behind the fine facade, all was mildewed. In August of 1806, the Prussians and their Saxon allies drew up 3 field armies with the intention of attacking the French, who were deployed across a wide sweep of southern Germany. One army, under Brunswick, concentrated between Naumburg and Leipzig. Another, under Hohenlohe, was around Dresden, and a small force, under Rückel and Blücher, gathered at Mulhausen and Göttingen. In all, the Prussians disposed of about 171,000 men and 300 guns. Before they had properly embarked upon a projected advance on Würzburg, they heard that Napoleon was already on the move, apparently making for Saxony. They then decided to mass west of the Saale, aiming to threaten Napoleon's left flank. And the impetuous Hohenlohe seized the opportunity to push part of his army well forward. Napoleon had concluded that his aim must be to beat the Prussians before the Russians, who had not sued for peace after Austerlitz, could intervene. He decided to concentrate behind the Thüringer Wald, in the area of Bamberg, Forchheim, Bayreuth, and Kronach, and then to move towards Leipzig with his army in 3 mutually supporting columns, totaling some 180,000 men. He called the formation the Bataillon Carré. It would be able to meet attack from any direction or to concentrate swiftly and fall on an opponent. There were to be diversions up the Rhine to keep the Prussians guessing. On the 10th of October, the French meet Hohenlohe's leading detachment, under Prince Louis Ferdinand, at Saalfeld. The prince was killed in action while arriving to prevent the collapse of his outnumbered force, and the news of his defeat induced Hohenlohe to fall back on Jena. Brunswick and Frederick William, meanwhile, determined to concentrate on Weimar. Although Napoleon's light cavalry, moving ahead of his columns, did their best to keep him informed, he was still not certain of the Prussians' dispositions. And the imminent climax of the campaign was overshadowed by the fact that while Napoleon knew that there was a substantial Prussian force around Jena, the bulk of the Prussian army, with Brunswick himself, was actually further back at Auerstadt. Early on the 14th of October, Napoleon attacked what he thought was a main Prussian army on the high ground just north of Jena, having sent Davout and Bernadotte on a wide right hook against the Prussian flank and rear. There were 2 distinct clashes that day. Napoleon, with some 96,000 men, beat the 66,000 Prussians and Saxons facing him in a hard-fought battle in which the Prussians showed their old, inflexible valor, but were no match for the French ability to concentrate superior numbers or for their tactical flexibility. At Auerstadt, the outnumbered Davout, controversially unsupported by Bernadotte, who got on badly with him, took on Brunswick himself with only 27,000 Frenchmen to perhaps 50,000 Prussians, and defeated him in a sparkling display of dogged courage and fluid tactics. Napoleon exploited this double victory remorselessly. Davout led his corps through Berlin on the 25th of October, and over the next few weeks, surviving Prussian field forces and garrisons were snapped up. Stettin fell in late October, and Hamburg the following month. A few survivors crossed the Oder to meet the Russians. The Prussian army, which had for so long set the standard to which many others aspired, had been comprehensively trounced. We will now enter into Chapter 13, the Grande Armee. The Grande Armee was a huge multinational force furnished with a complex command apparatus, but all designed to serve Napoleon's directing will. The armies of the Republic had geographical titles like the Army of the North, the Army of the Reserve, and the Army of Italy. The same principle continued under the Empire, but France's main army, usually under Napoleon himself, was often titled La Grande Armée, although the phrase now does duty to describe the French army of the era more generally. Yet the Grande Armée was not simply French. In the 1805 campaign, the Reserve Corps contained a division each of Bavarians, Württembergers, Badeners, and in the army that invaded Russia in 1812, there were Austrians, Badeners, Bavarians, Croats, Dutch, Hessians, Illyrians, Italians, Mecklenburgers, Neapolitans, Poles, Portuguese, Prussians, Saxons, Spaniards, Swiss, Westphalians, and Württembergers, to say nothing of the men from the Grand Duchy of Berg and smaller German principalities. Some states produced contingents of proven reliability. The Poles had an affinity for Napoleon, largely because he had restored their country, thrice partitioned between greedy neighbors, in the form of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. It was the Polish first Chevalier de Guerre, Lancier de la Légion de la Vistula, who struck such a devastating blow to Colborne's British brigade at Albuera in 1811. At the other extreme, Prussian cooperation was rarely more than grudging, and it was the Prussian General York's decision to conclude the Convention of Tauroggen in December of 1812 that began a disintegration of the alliance structure which Napoleon had imposed on Europe. At the center of the whole polyglot and polychromatic organization was the Maison Militaire de l'Empereur, Napoleon's military household, with its three key figures: Berthier, the chief of staff; Dirac, the grand marshal of the palace, responsible for the organization of the household; and Caulaincourt, master of the horse, who oversaw all matters equine, from the organization of the stables to messengers and escorts. A handful of senior generals, the official aides-de-camp, stood ready to take on special tasks, and young orderly officers were on hand to carry messages. The emperor's personal cabinet included 3 private secretaries, who were expected to take down orders by day or night. The topographical office, headed by the methodical Baclair de Albe, produced maps and maintained a situation chart. Napoleon often rode out with his small headquarters, consisting of Berthier, Caulaincourt, the duty marshal, 2 aides-de-camp, 2 orderly officers, an equerry, a page carrying the emperor's telescope, a cavalryman with a portfolio of maps and a pair of compasses, the Mameluke Rustam, his personal bodyguard, a former slave who had been given to Napoleon as a gift in Cairo, a groom, and an interpreter. 4 squadrons of guard cavalry followed close behind. Napoleon sat in a light carriage for longer journeys, and for more substantial trips used a special post-chaise with a folding bed, desks, and bookshelves, and even concealed diamonds in case his imperial bubble burst. The army's headquarters was much bigger, 3,500 officers and 10,000 men in 1812, and comprised Berthier's private staff and private office, and the general staff of the army, divided into 3 loosely defined branches, one responsible for operations, one for food, accommodation, and hospitals, and the third for prisoners of war, conscripts, and military justice. This was not a headquarters in modern sense. There was duplication and repetitive office work, and nobody, from Berthier downwards, was permitted any initiative. The whole apparatus existed to serve Napoleon's directing will. Napoleon worked on an 18-hour day on a campaign, responding to the previous day's reports in the small hours, sleeping briefly before dealing with routine work, some of it non-military, for he was as much of a centralizer as head of state as he was a general. Orders and dispatches in the morning, and running to visit units in the afternoon. This pattern of work produced a pulse of daily activity, with corps commanders receiving written orders from gallopers in the morning and acting on them before submitting their reports at nightfall. Napoleon was capable of dictating several sets of orders at the same time. It was a style of command that made it hard to know if a subordinate really understood the essence of a plan. Nowhere was this more marked than in the ambiguous orders sent to Grouchy before Waterloo. Personal visits were scarcely less important than written orders. Napoleon was a fine, if somewhat theatrical, communicator, and his soldiers treasured praise and were distraught by rebukes. If his headquarters provided the mechanical impulsion that drove the Grande Armee along, it was the glimpse of a squat figure in a gray riding coat, and the sound of language that could make a grenadier blush, that lifted its soldiers' spirits. We will now enter into Chapter 14, Berlin to Tilsit. Napoleon's crushing victories at Eylau and Friedland were crowned at Tilsit, where he dictated terms to the Russian Tsar and Prussian king. At Jena-Auerstadt, Napoleon had won a battle, but not the war. The King of Prussia was safe in Königsberg. Russia was safe in Königsberg. Russia was hostile, and though Austria was neutral, her acquiescence could not be guaranteed. Napoleon attributed this Fourth Coalition's survival to British gold, and in November of 1806, he signed the Berlin Decrees, ordering the closure of continental ports to British goods, the beginning of what was to become known as the Continental System. Britain responded in early 1807 with orders in council that declared France and her allies to be under blockade. Neutral vessels intercepted with contraband were liable to seizure. In late November 1806, Napoleon pushed eastwards on a wide front, taking Warsaw on the 28th of November and establishing himself a central position from where he could deal with Bennigsen's Russians as they appeared. But an attempt to encircle them northeast of Warsaw in December misfired, and in early February 1807, Napoleon narrowly failed to catch Bennigsen on the river Eylau. Despite atrocious weather, when the Russians paused at Eylau on the 7th of February, Napoleon concentrated to attack them. The battle began that day with a struggle for Eylau, although we cannot tell if this was Napoleon's original intention. Most soldiers of both armies spent a miserable night in the open, and the following morning the French attacked in flurries of snow, initially outnumbered, but with both armies rising to about 75,000 as reinforcements arrived. Napoleon hoped to use Davout's corps, still on its way, to turn Bennigsen's left flank and attack the Russian center to pin him to his position while the maneuver took place. But the Russians engaged both Napoleon's flanks before Davout was ready, and the Emperor sent Augereau against the Russian center left. Augereau's troops lost direction in the snow and marched straight into a mass Russian battery which halted them before infantry counterattacked, sweeping the survivors back. Napoleon turned to his cavalry, and in the late morning ordered Murat to charge the masses of Russian infantry who were pressing in on Eylau. This charge tore deep into the Russian center and bought valuable time. The advantage swung first to the French, as Davout pushed back on the Russian left, and then to the Russians, as Letocq's Prussians fell on Davout's open flank. But at the very end of the day, Ney's corps came up on the French left, and although it was beaten back, it put new heart into Napoleon's men. That night, Bennigsen decided to retreat, having lost perhaps 15,000 men, fewer than the French, whose losses may have been up to 25,000. Even Ney was shocked by the sight of the battlefield. What a massacre, and without a result. Napoleon put his men into winter quarters, and contemplated his next move. Reinforcements were needed to make good the losses. Some conscripts of the class of 1808 were called up 18 months early, and lads of the class of 1807 began to arrive. Lefebvre was sent to besiege Danzig, taking it in May, but in June the French had the worst of a major action at Heilsberg on the Aile. Then, deducing that Benningsen was making for Königsberg, then held by Letocq's Prussians, Napoleon planned a wide encircle movement. However, he misjudged Benningsen, who determined to attack Lannes' corps at Friedland, southwest of Königsberg, before help could arrive. Lannes held Benningsen in play on the morning of the 14th of June, and in the late afternoon, Napoleon was strong enough to attack. Although a French cavalry attack failed to break the last Russian resistance, the results of the day were impressive. For the loss of 8,000 men, the French had killed or wounded almost 20,000 Russians. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander met, with the King of Prussia as an uneasy member of the trio. At Tilsit on the River Niemen, the border between Russia and Prussia, in late June and early July, Prussia was the real loser in their deliberations, emerging shorn of most of her outlying dominions and paying a huge war indemnity. Napoleon turned westwards, confident that he had real personal understanding with the Tsar. It was, perhaps, the apogee of his success. And with that, we will conclude today's episode. Tune in next time, where we will begin with Chapter 15, Cavalry. I'll see y'all then. Take care.